Good evening. Welcome to the Center for Global Humanities. This is our 11th year, can you believe it? 11th year of operation. And thank you. It's been quite a ride all these years. And, but it's always getting even more exciting. Every day, every week, every month. I get more excited anyway by the caliber of the speakers we have. And tonight is a very exceptional one. So I am delighted to introduce Françoise Hamlin. She is an associate professor of history and Africana studies at Brown University. She earned her doctorate in African American studies and American studies at Yale University, her master's from the University of London, and her BA from the University of Essex, both in United States studies. Hamlin is the author of Crossroads at Clarksdale, The Black Freedom Struggle in the Mississippi Delta After World War II, published by University of North Carolina Press in 2012, winner of the 2012 Berkshire Conference of Women Historians Book Prize, and the 2013 Lillian Smith Book Award. These truly are the brave, an anthology of African-American writings on citizenship and war. It's a co-edited anthology published by the University of Florida Press in 2015. It was a finalist for the QBR 2016 Whitley Book Award in Nonfiction and was republished in paperback in 2018. Hamlin's new research focuses on young people, trauma, and activism. Her most notable fellowships and awards include the C. Van Woodward Dissertation Prize, the Du Bois Mandela Rodney Fellowship at the University of Michigan, the Charles Warren Center Fellowship at Harvard University, a Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship, and the Frederick Burkhardt Residential Fellowship from the American Council of Learned Societies. In addition, she has won major mentoring and teaching awards at Brown University. And everybody who met her tonight knows what a wonderful person she is. So help me welcome Françoise to the podium.
When I hear that biography, it always makes me look around. Who are they talking about? Thank you. I'm blown away by how many people are here. I was not expecting that. So thank you all for coming out and for this invitation to speak to you today. It really is an honor. And I've never been to Portland. I've never been to Maine. And I will definitely be back further to come and explore more when I have a little bit more time. In the middle of the semester is always a little bit difficult to get away, but I'm glad to be here. So what I'd like to do today is really just get straight into it so that we'll have time for questions and answers. It seems that a lot of you are really interested in this topic, and I anticipate questions. So this is a works in progress for me, part of a larger book project where I think about the costs of activism during the mass movement years for civil rights in America. What I'm going to do here is to present a piece of it and hopefully begin this discussion. And I hope it's not too disjointed because, when you're pulling from a bigger project, you're pulling from different directions. So ask for clarification in the question and answers if I have made too many assumptions. So this larger book project emerged from research in Mississippi, where I repeatedly heard stories about lost childhoods or activists from what we commonly call the civil rights movement who never quite recovered from the trauma of their work. The two main interviews that stuck with me always were from two women whose parents ran the local movement in Clarksdale, Mississippi, which is the site of my first book, Crossroads in Clarksdale. Anger punctuated one interview with Rebecca Henry, daughter of Aaron Henry. 10 full years after the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court ruling, she was named the plaintiff in the suit filed to desegregate Clarksdale City Schools in 1964. And I describe this in detail in the book. She only attended segregated institutions because the case dragged on for nearly 6 years, well beyond her school attending years. And the schools desegregated under court order in January 1970, but it was never perfect. Rebecca Henry's father was Aaron Henry, and he was the local branch and state president for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, and he spent considerable time away from home, leaving Rebecca and her mother, Noelle, to parry the verbal blows and deal with the real terror every time they picked up the phone or exited their house. And as a result, she spent her life bitterly in his shadow, resenting his life work and all the accolades he'd collected, and mourning the loss of her childhood without her father's presence. Mary Jane Piggy Davis took part in direct actions as a youth. Before the waves of students elevated the visibility of organized mass protests in Mississippi. She and folk singers, Guy and Candy Carawan, held the first integrated music concert in Clarksdale in January 1961. And later that year, August 23rd, she desegregated the train station, testing the boundaries of Jim Crow, just as the Freedom Riders were doing so across the South that spring and that summer. She got arrested multiple times in those years. Her mother was Vera Piggy, and she was an activist mother, branch secretary of the local NAACP branch, and the youth council advisor. Her leadership attracted hate calls and violence. It got so bad that the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission file on Mary Jane Piggy was robust. In essence, she was being tracked by the state's white supremacist version of COINTELPRO. Davis's memories were also saturated with regret and some bitterness. She walked through her childhood with police officers following her, and she said, "I wonder why I gave up my childhood," when she looked at the youth today. And she was not nostalgic for her place of birth, saying, "I didn't owe Clarksdale anything. I gave what I could when I could." Now, it's too easy to dismiss Rebecca Henry's complaints as merely echoing the desire for a nuclear-style family, and similarly Mary Davis's exasperation caused by current deterioration of hard-won rights. There's something that's running much deeper. These women in their adulthood manifested signs of trauma and depression triggered by events in their youth, and it affected their future life choices and social interactions. Mary Jane Piggy Davis left Mississippi, eventually moving to Detroit, where she died a couple of years ago. We got to talk a lot in the last decade about her life and her mother's life and the price activism exacted. Rebecca Henry died of complications to diabetes in 1999, 2 years after her father and months after I interviewed her. Both women questioned the success of the movement and the costs of their sacrifices, given the reality of persistent prejudice cloaked in new language and strategies of repression and denial. Now, this is not what I expected when I was doing my interviews for the book. It runs counter to how the movement is memorialized, what I like to call the kumbaya phenomenon, right? This is not that. They were young people, children and youth. And once I started looking for them, for other examples of young people who experienced trauma, they were everywhere. From the Clarksdale tests that provide the ammunition for the NAACP as they fought for the Brown decision. Little Rock, Arkansas. Ruby Bridges, the little girl who desegregated the schools in New Orleans. These are some of the famous images that we see. These children are on the front lines in this movement. And in most of these photographs, they're experiencing violence against them, violence that leaves psychological as well as physical scars. So let me talk briefly about Anne Moody. How many of you actually got to read the autobiography? This is the homework question. Okay. So this is a renowned book, often assigned in schools, colleges, and universities, brilliantly relaying the stark events of her childhood in the southwest section of the state and her activity in the mass movement. This is an iconic photograph of Anne Moody. How many of you recognize this image? She's a student at Tougaloo College in Jackson, Mississippi, sitting on a stool at the downtown Woolworth's lunch counter in 1963. She sits with two white protesters, Joan Trumpor and John Salter, and behind them a mob of young men gleefully pour condiments all over them while hurling insults and deadly threats. This image represents both the bravery and rage that propelled the era's Black freedom struggles in the nation. 5 years later, in 1968, Anne Moody published Coming of Age in Mississippi, her autobiography chronicling her childhood and activism in the Mississippi movement. Her prose is blunt and powerful. She calmly described terror, pain, intense fear, complete exhaustion, and mental breakdown. Yet Anne Moody slipped into obscurity by choice, refusing to give interviews or appear in public. Rumors swirled about her life after Mississippi. And like Rosa Parks, she became the symbol of that one moment in time. Only recently, thanks to historians like Danielle Maguire, has the narrative of Mrs. Park actually expanded to include her activist years before she stood up to Jim Crow by staying seated. But in Coming of Age, there is very little joy, and this is the recording of her first 23 years. One disappointment follows the other. She does give two interviews in 1985 that provided a window of this gritty reality that she faced. And for her, the pivot was the gruesome murder of Emmett Till, because it created an immediate psychic wound. In 1985, in that interview, Moody noted that the Till case was the moment she realized that she needed to be an activist. It became more real to me, and I became more aware of the fact that it happens not only to adult Black men, but children my own age. The murder itself was heinous, and as it was, that's one thing. But the way that the adults chose to deal with it made her lose respect for them. They chose not to speak of it when children were present. But being the curious child that she was, Moody eavesdropped and heard the horrors and witnessed the silences. And she said, it becomes sort of a very shattering type of experience for that child. It creates a barrier, not just of communication, but a barrier of feelings too. You begin to build a wall around yourself, but it's very weird. Literary theorist Kelly McKay has noted that psychologists agree that children develop their basic cognitive and conceptual maps of the world at a very early age, and while these may be modified later, they do not disappear. She is part of the Emmett Till generation, those of the same age who directly connected to him and whose death galvanized their will to change the society where such crimes could go unpunished. The publication of these photographs in Jet magazine brought this case to the national and international spotlight. It's not like Till was any different from all the other people who had been killed, but it was these photographs and the dissemination of these photographs that really does galvanize this generation, and Jet is one of those publications that is in every Black home. Moody earnestly looked for escape, physically from a grim future of domestic and farm work, and psychologically from what she had defined as fear-based paralysis in her community, and worse, her family. She kept herself busy with school and learned that she couldn't even hide when she became an activist. Her trauma began before her activism, the trauma of truth, the trauma of Jim Crow. She thought the academia and academics would be the source of escape for her. She had hoped to be a doctor and directly service her people. While movement activism became a vehicle for her hurt and outrage against her home community, she saw as impotent, it did very little to heal her. She felt impotent too. And then we're back to this image in Woolworths, Jackson, Mississippi. While feeling responsible to the community she served, always returning to the source of her fears and nightmares, she carried what she called conflicting, sometimes desperate feelings about the efficacy of her work. Serious doubts about the movement's success. And these feelings were compounded by the crushing guilt that her work endangered her family in rural Centerville. Revealing deep pain and angst, she said, "My nerves were torn to shreds." And she says this in her autobiography. And in 1985, when she talked about the mental effects of battle fatigue, that so many activists felt, she said. It wears, it tears at the root of your heart. Her activism, or rather the effects of her activism, did very little to soothe what she called her anguished mind, and then her feelings of dislocation from family, from purpose, from future. And this becomes even more marked when she leaves Mississippi on a DC-bound bus with literally just the clothes on her back. And this is the point where she actually ends her autobiography. In 1985, she was rather blasé about that moment. And this is what she said. I got on a bus in Jackson, Mississippi. I ran away from Canton when a kid had gotten his brains splattered all over the church grounds down in Canton. When I saw that bus going to Washington, I just ran and got in and sat down. Her activism, which she hoped would be a source of refuge, exiled her further from her community. She hoped that the movement would have been an escape, but it exacerbated her trauma and sense of loss. When she escaped Mississippi, she had no money, and she lived with activists in DC before embarking on speaking tours for the Congress of Racial Equality, which was the organization she was working for in Mississippi. And so that summer, she did that work to tell the nation what was going on in the state and to raise money. At the big United Auto Workers Convention in Atlantic City, she heard about the disappearance of Mickey Schwerner, Andy Goodman, and James Chaney in Mississippi. So overcome by emotion, knowing immediately that they were probably dead, she said, I worked myself into such a state, I just started crying, and I just couldn't speak anymore. Everyone was moved. As a result of that, she raised $20,000 that day. As she recalled that speech, it is clear that her trauma had a receptive audience. Whether she intended it or not at the time, trauma became a fundraiser. The murders of the 3 civil rights workers put her over the edge, as she put it. And she said, I was shipped to the New Yorkers, to the Easterners. I was like shell-shocked. I was half out of my mind. Desperately needing a change of pace, she took the job working as a civil rights project coordinator at Cornell through 1965. With her experience, she worked in the New York State School of Industrial and Labor Relations Divisions, which was the extension associate in New York City, helping to train students in effective labor organizing. And then she starts writing Coming of Age after the 3 workers are found dead in August '64. She married Austin Strauss on March 9th, '67, and their tumultuous marriage would only last 10 years, but it produced a son, Sasha. The book took a lot out of her, not just writing, but the constant publicity work that she did after it became popular. It was first reviewed by Senator Edward Kennedy in the New York Times Book Review, and as you can imagine, that put the book on the national map. And so she said, I just wanted to go away quietly and recover. And so from '69 to '74, she and her husband lived in Europe. So you can say that her writing, which she considered her freedom, and her therapy, also became her prison. She published a children's book in 1975 called Mr. Death. I would not let my child read this book. And in the mid-'80s, she claimed a handful of unfinished and unpublished manuscripts, which no one has ever found, by the way. However, she's forever stuck in the pages of Coming of Age in Mississippi, unable to break free from the story that was meant to free her. And there's a lot more I can say about Anne Moody and her life. She died in February 2015 in Mississippi, but I'll stop here for the sake of time and move to a broader discussion about Black trauma and make those parallels between the past and the present. Why is it important to know about Anne Moody's story, or Rebecca Henry's, or Mary Jane Piggy Davis, or any of these young people? What does it tell us about the prices young activists paid through their work in the Black freedom struggle? For one, thinking about her experiences as an activist and the decades afterwards through the lens of trauma and psychological injury forces us to validate the reality of her life and that of so many others. She had a forum where she could express herself, yet found no healing. And it forces us to think about trauma and its afterlife. What changes to our national story of the civil rights movement when we consider the lingering ambivalence and pain suffered by so many of these young people? How can these stories complicate notions of freedom and justice? So the larger project demands a drastic rethinking of American history, particularly the civil rights movement, to balance the triumphalist narrative with a more nuanced assessment of the prices paid by young activists and the difficulties in sustaining justice work in a nation devoid of justice. So when I talk about this project, I listen very carefully to the responses and who offers comments. I've been writing a lot of grant applications in order to buy time from teaching, in order to research, a practice that takes up way too much time in itself. But I consistently face this question. Well, white folks suffer trauma too. Why aren't you focusing on them? Or why are only black folks getting the attention? Indeed, when we returned to this lunch counter in Jackson, Anne Moody shared that terrorized space with two others. Yet they both had more choices and more prospects than Moody. She could not escape her racial status. She did not have her free range of colleges from which to choose, nor did she have the economic freedom to earn a decent living away in any way she chose in a Jim Crow society. Her family paid the cost for her presence there, even though they didn't support her. They were terrorized in their spaces and homes, miles away from the lunch counter in Jackson. John Salter was a young professor at Tougaloo College, and Joan Trumpo was a student there. They chose to organize, but did so out of moral imperatives and had privileges and opportunities to escape Jim Crow by merely blending into a white supremacist society and not speaking out. That was their choice. Certainly, many white Mississippians and Southerners remained silent despite their discomfort and misgivings, leading perfectly good lives in a Jim Crow society. John Salter actually died in January this year in Idaho, and Joan Trumpo lives in Virginia and goes around the country talking about her movement years from 50 years ago. She was also a freedom rider, which is where this mugshot comes from. And while Salter's and Trumpo's chosen paths were both heroic and noteworthy, I would never want to take away from the bravery it took to be on that lunch counter stool or to do the work that they did. And they definitely have a place in the history of the mass civil rights movement. My project focuses more on those who couldn't easily escape or blend in because of the very fact of their race. For instance, the children desegregating their local schools can't hide their race as they walk through the hostile hallways. Their race and the meaning of their race in this country excluded them in the first place and marks them in multiple ways. The experience of blackness in the US, broadly defined, comes with an intensely violent and debilitating historical legacy. This traumatic legacy informs how those who experience blackness move through the world, regardless of current circumstances that might not be as harmful. This traumatic legacy becomes family and group inheritances that socialize and shape. It becomes a baseline upon which new experiences and encounters at best minimize, or at worst support and layer, further traumas actually suffered by an individual. And going off on a tangent, there's the science of epigenetics, right, that's evolving. And some scientists, and I'm not a scientist, this is not my field, I'm just dipping my toes in, but a lot of them are looking at how trauma affects genes and gene inheritance. So that's another direction for scientists to go in. Blackness marks people, and unless we engage with those that can pass, which I'm not doing, and as such, Black parents themselves affected by traumatic legacies socialize their young accordingly. This is Black trauma. Anne Moody's socialization reflected this. In her autobiography, she constantly referenced her disappointment with her family and the other adults around her who encouraged her not to rock the boat and just do well in school. She asked too many questions. Emmett Till's slaughter was a pivot for so many in her generation, but it wounded Moody intimately. Mrs. Burke, whose home she cleaned and whose son she tutored, terrorized her in the aftermath by pointedly asking her loaded questions. He was killed because he got out of his place with a white woman. How old are you? See, that boy was 14 too. It's a shame he had to die so soon. Real economic needs meant that many African American parents had little choice but to prematurely expose children to racism's ugliness. Moody's mother, Elmira Jefferson, kept silent and refused to engage in any conversation with her daughter that might explain the horrors as a strategy to overcome her own powerlessness. She may have lacked a vocabulary to explain the terrorism, a deficiency fostered through purposeful undereducation. She herself, a trauma victim of Jim Crow, and there's a lot of research and scholarship to support how systemic racism makes sure to exclude Black communities from adequate education that could transform their lives from enslavement to the present. And as a result, no one could offer Anne Moody a counter-narrative with which to maintain a healthy sense of self. And she lost respect for the way the adults chose to deal with the murder, as I mentioned. In Burke's presence, Moody suffered under Jim Crow's ritual humiliation. But Moody's mother did not buffer her child. She could not, as the necessity to work for survival superseded all else. Many poor Black parents had no shields to protect their children, and they socialized them to work hard and to keep one's head down. Silence became a coping mechanism for living in constant fear. But a curious Moody eavesdropped, like I said, and heard the horrors that her parents and the other adults were trying to protect her from. And without sufficient outlet to explain or discuss her experience, her young mind could only wander into the abyss of stress, hurt, fear, and distrust. And this layer of psychic wounding would hurt Moody throughout her life. This emotional punishment is at times worse than the physical punishment, right? As some wounds do not heal. The spirit remains bruised. And this affective injury, the emotional punishment of activist work, became a consequence of the movement work for so many people, yet we don't talk about it enough. At the time, folks knew Moody had suffered, hence placing her on the fundraising tour, designed to use her traumatic experiences to elicit empathy and to generate funds. Yet she got no professional mental health care. Her trauma was marketed and her mental health deteriorated. Why is it important to acknowledge Black trauma? Silence permeates the history of Black trauma, not only among African Americanists, but in larger circles outside the academy. The silence and silencing emerge from two fronts. First is the outright denial of trauma. Doesn't exist. Then there's the claim that trauma exposes shame and weakness, qualities not befitting freedom fighters. And this often comes from activists and veterans themselves, acculturated to think of mental health as a taboo, or to see it as damaging this legacy that they had so carefully built. The term trauma is loaded with meaning and complications. Indeed, the term has casually entered mainstream discourse in the last century, and there are many multidisciplinary studies, from defining shell shock to expanding post-traumatic stress disorder. And I went to a conference in 2010, a national conference that was dedicated to trauma study, sponsored by one of the leading institutions in this field with dedicated faculty and resources and with all its experts, right? So I thought, I'm going to go there and I'm going to learn about trauma and I'm going to have the answer. In that space, the definition of trauma was a moving target. Even they couldn't define it. So it really depends on the fields and the applications. from psychologists' clinical definitions, which have changed over time, to advocates of victims of domestic, usually gendered abuse, to those in Holocaust studies. All of those people in all of those different fields, in all of those fields, the acknowledgement of race skirted around the panels and wider discussions, particularly in discussions that centered on the US. Discussions about child soldiering in Africa was okay, but not racial trauma in the US. The field itself has adopted a rhetoric of colorblindness that prohibits remembering ongoing racial inequalities, even in the field, that continue to inflict psychic harm. This manifestation of the territorialization of trauma, a term borrowed from theorist Maurice Stevens, from the definitions to the diagnosis and the treatment became very clear to me as I began this project and as I continue through it. Criticism about my scope, my focus on Black people rather than white people, my intentions, I'm digging up old mess, to overstating, to feeding the trolls, came from all sides and all angles, which makes it really difficult to have the confidence to keep going, but I'm stubborn too. Does this mean that trauma is assumed by the very nature of traumatic legacies and inheritance, that all Black people have psychic injuries from which they must survive and thrive? Does this premise give ammunition to those wishing to believe in innate deficiencies among certain groups? Or does it bolster the innate strengths and resilience among those without the baggage of traumatic inheritances? So such attention and criticism actually spurs me further. African Americans, the focus of my study, have historically carried the dismissive claim that they exist without meaningful interiority, and thus can't experience trauma as white beings only can. And as such, Black trauma remains controversial. Its very existence widely contested, as I've suggested. And it goes back to the historical denial of humanity that manifests still. Look at the current slew of studies about how medical schools teach future physicians that Black folks feel less pain and therefore don't need pain meds. And these are studies coming out of med school. We don't live in a culture where Black humanity is taken for granted. It always has to be argued, defended, and proved. It's constant. And I gesture towards Black humanity through Black trauma, and it demands a different register for the general reader to accept. Because we are oriented to only imagine Black subjects as a figure of resistance, and Moody as the freedom fighter, for instance, we deny them the basic recognition as complex humans. And here I'm borrowing heavily from the work of my colleague at Brown, Kevin Kwashi. If Blackness and Black people become the object from which we understand the mess of the world, right, the canary in the coal mine scenario, then Black people themselves are excluded from their own humanity, and the different layers and ways of being that go beyond resistance gets lost. If we think solely as Black activists, as resistance fighters or resistance figures, what gets lost in translation? Like the diversity of Black existence. As Kwashi says, we need to restore a broader picture of humanity. Black folks are expected to cohere around a singleness of being. We don't get to be because the very narrow ideas of Blackness interrupt the possibility of just being. Acknowledging Black trauma makes many people uncomfortable. Sit with that discomfort. And I don't say that as a punishment or as a type of revenge, but I say it to encourage thought and empathy. This should be the ultimate work of truth and reconciliation projects. Acknowledging Black trauma might actually do the work of healing rather than the work of lessening feelings of guilt. Guilt has no place if we are to get to a different and better place. And yet, with recognition, recognition should have some positive action behind it. And it is necessary to walk in someone else's shoes in order to understand and then concede why those shoes look different and feel different to yours. In order to have real justice, we need to acknowledge Black trauma. And as a society, this acknowledgement hasn't really happened. So I'm a historian, and I find comfort in the past when the present frustrates me. So you can imagine I'm just living in the past right now. Yet despite all of my efforts to keep it historical, it's really hard to with this project. I can't ignore the Tripwire anchored in the 2012 slaying of Trayvon Martin in Florida. Is he the Emmett Till of Mississippi? That seeded the Black Lives Matter movement, galvanizing young people the way Till's murder had, and then which the murder of Mike Brown in 2014 in St. Louis accelerated. As a mother of a Black boy, it's hard to keep this in the past. It unsettles me to no end because it raises the stakes of historical writing. It elevates the analysis in a way that affects the thinking and dialogue of current activists, negotiating the very same traumas as their historical predecessors. So we have to talk about it. I had to embrace that responsibility and work through how it would affect the academic work I initially envisioned. It is almost impossible to isolate historic trauma from present-day realities, even though it draws criticism of presentist scholarship and all the attendant pitfalls that we warn our students about, right, when we analyze the past with a present-day lens. This topic specifically makes the project of historical specificity difficult. The trauma evident on social media, following spates of Black death at the hands of unregulated and unpunished police specifically, tightens the line between the past and the present. It allows us to read trauma with more nuance and compassion because that trauma continues. There's a straight line. With cell phones and body cameras, we see people die every day. We see it. We are all witnesses, and every death cuts deep as though one of our own kin had perished. There is now a new perceived linked fate that binds so many Black people, one forged through unpunished and unmitigated violence on Black bodies from all walks of life, that keeps our bonds to the past taut and visible, despite the legal death of Jim Crow. So how does the denial of Black trauma mirror how too many in this nation still view violence against Black bodies and state-sanctioned murder with little empathy or with any sense of indignation at the hypocrisy? What has changed? Can we say the civil rights movement was successful when this still continues? If things have really changed, and I would controversially argue, because I like to be the devil's advocate here, when the Black Lives Matter slogan came to the fore, if things had really changed, there wouldn't have been the immediate reaction to insist that all lives matter. Of course they do. No one said only Black Lives Matter. But that slogan demands a reckoning that most folks refuse to face, despite the copious number of examples of the extinguishing of Black life with no recourse. Today's proliferation of monuments and museums, half apologies, truth and reconciliation committees, and the like, do not always take the continued reverberation of trauma in the culture and in the community. Staying vigilant about memorializing the past without obscuring present trauma obstructs any attempt to declare closure and a full healing, like I mentioned before. So I chose to show Black people, like Anne Moody, and too many others, as whole, effective beings, and engaging with multiple identities in relation to trauma. And I hope that working through these issues further using the case study of the civil rights movement, using my own skills as a historian, that I can do what other people are also trying to do. And here I show pictures of the past and the present, people doing the same thing on the streets. While I do that, I urge you all to think about what needs to be done now, today, to acknowledge Black trauma, and to understand that working through that, we can find lasting solutions that will go a long way in affecting real, lasting, positive change in this national culture. Thank you.
If you have a question, there are microphones on both sides of the room. Raise your hand and get a mic and then ask your question. Thank you.
Where did that voice come from? Oh, okay.
I think we'll go right in front here.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful presentation. I had a question about, so I don't know if in part of your work you engage with the When They Call You a Terrorist, the book, the Black Lives Matter memoir by Patricia Conn-Kollers. And in there's a very sort of rich discussion of self-care. And I wonder if you, in your research, in your historical research, identified practices of self-care that didn't take maybe institutional form or the form of mental health interventions that you say are lacking at the time.
Right. Yes, I have read that autobiography, and yes, so in the historical work, I'm looking for those examples of when communities and individuals and groups try to take care of each other and themselves, and then how some of them did get professional help, but how those professional caregivers were actually having to train themselves to do this work specifically, and most of them were volunteers themselves in the movement. So it was on the job, trying to figure it out. And so part of what I hope this project will do is help educate the current activists so that they don't have to reinvent that wheel, right? And what's really wonderful about the Black Lives Matter and many of the leaders is that they're already in tune to all of that as already. But obviously not enough, right? Because we're still seeing how some of these leaders were committing suicide, right? And all of this. So there's something still going on. And I think the pressures are different because of social media as well. Thank you.
Got a question over here.
Thank you for a provocative talk. I appreciate it. Obviously, I'm a white boy, and
That's okay.
I grew up as a middle-class white boy in an upper-middle-class ghetto, so that taints everything I do, obviously. Last several years I've worked, and I'd like your comments on this observation of mine. Last several years I've worked with the immigrant community here in Portland, many of whom are, I don't know if it's most, but probably most of whom are from Black Africa. And I've sensed their trauma, and their attitude seemed though to be a little different, because their trauma appears to be, if you ask them about their family, you know how they respond? Gone. And what they mean is, they don't know. Somebody came along in the middle of the night and shot them, if they were lucky. Otherwise, they tortured them. And at the same time, I don't sense in them the resentment of me and the other people in this largely white state being here. They're just glad to be here away from their trauma. Can you elaborate on that maybe?
Well, you weren't the result of their family being killed. So that's why they're not mad at you. Right? I mean, just for a really sort of glib answer, but there's that. And I would suggest that they're working through their own issues themselves and sort of the cultural ways of dealing with trauma are different for communities. And so as the second generation become American and are raised in the US, it would be interesting to talk to them about how they think about their family's trauma, right, and loss, but what kind of lives are they building in the US where they are now African American, right, because they're second generation. Yeah, it has to be history before I touch it, but yes.
We got a question over here.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
From a different angle, comparing what you talked about to the immigrant experience right now. My mother came from a very traumatized immigrant experience, and I think it took, leaving aside how long it took for her to talk about it, I think it took a couple generations of research and consciousness to acknowledge that type of persecution and trauma. As this gentleman said, there are a lot of African immigrants who have come here seeking asylum with persecution. And I think the response of the mental health community now is substantially different than it was. And so drawing those parallels or comparisons, but knowing nothing about this, I'm interested in how much general discussion there is in the African American community about trauma, the effects of trauma. So if you go to Clarksdale or whatever again, and move beyond the frontline people, the civil rights people, or Baltimore, or St. Louis, or Florida, whether there is a similar openness and consciousness discussion that you're bringing forward of trauma, or whether it's really still very particularized, or whether your research is really on the cutting edge of putting all of this out, almost in the same way that the warmth of other suns started us thinking of immigrants within this country and what they went through, and thinking of immigrants in a completely different way, you know, and all of what that migration caused. If there's the same kinds of levels of discussion in the trauma research world here.
Yes, it's generational, right? So younger people talk about it way more than older folks. So has been a cultural shift towards understanding mental health care and understanding mental illness is not a taboo. And so among older generations, it takes longer to do that, as you know, you've seen with your own family. And particularly with families who have lived in the same place for generations and have continued to, you know, I mean, close communities, this trauma just gets recycled, right? And continues because folks are still there. No one leaves. It's just generations of people, families on both sides, if you want to call it sides. But yes, the sort of the taboo of mental health and illnesses is beginning to change in African, and I'm totally generalizing here, but in most African American communities, and that education is beginning to change. Ideas of treatment and what that would look like still have to change more, because the way racialization works, a lot of folks think of mental health as a negative, it's you know, illness is negative, but as a way in which it would further decrease opportunities or further decrease how Black folks in general get painted with the same brush. And all of those politics come into play. But what I was actually in Clarksdale last week, and so seeing the young folks and what they were doing was quite invigorating, actually. But it's just this generation. It's beginning to happen.
We got another question over here, Professor Hamlin.
Hi.
Hi.
When I saw the slide of it's 2016 and we're still protesting this shit, it's 2019 and we're still protesting this shit. But I thought about when I was a youngster, and I was 6 years old, and I was doing my spelling, and my neighbor came by, and the word was Negro. And he said, you know you're one of them, right? He's black. And I was like, I am not. And he's like, yes, you are. I said, I am not. So I ran inside crying to my mother. And I said, Mom, Boo called me a Negro. And she said, what, are you crazy? Of course you are. The other side of that slide, for a 6-year-old boy, were up above of firefighters and police officers. So in my mind, and growing up, firefighters and police officers are good. So if those people are being attacked by dogs and being sprayed by firefighters, then they must be bad. And because they were labeled as Negroes, then I'm not one of them because me and my people in that community weren't bad. Okay? So I had a little brother who's 25 now. He was 11. And Big Brother, Little Brother program. And I picked him up to do something, and he was upset. And I said, what's going on? And he said, well, Nolan, why is it bad to be black? And I was like, what? And he just recounted his day. Okay, and that was how many years ago? I have a client who's a black kid, and he's now 11, but he was like 6, 7, or 8. And he goes to almost predominantly white school in a couple of towns from here. And I picked him, and he came to my office about stuff, and he was sad, and I said, what's wrong? So we're talking 3 years, so we're talking 2015, 2016. And he said, I don't know, why is it bad to be black? And so when you talk trauma, people think about fire hoses or being pulled over and terrorized. When still in 2019, the trauma is the air that we live in. That where little boys who haven't begun to really form a true image of themselves still come away breathing this air, believing that inherently there's something wrong with them because of their skin color. And that's a trauma in of itself, just being sometimes in a society.
There wasn't a question there, right? Okay. I just want to make sure Oh. Yes, so the injury doesn't have to come after being hit on the head. It doesn't have to be that. Violence can happen psychically and in the culture itself, right? And it's kind of cultural representation and how race is used to vilify certain groups or communities causes trauma too, an interiority. And it's hard to undo it. It's hard to undo it. It's hard to undo it. And when your parents have already gone through that and are who they are, what do you tell them what you know? And as sort of a parent myself, I have to, and then doing this work, I have to catch myself. I'm like, okay, I can't raise him the way I was raised. And I was raised in England, so it's a whole other series of stuff going on there, but there's a way in which, we were taught to be scared of the police and to act a certain way. And in many ways, you have to still do that with your black child in order to keep them safe, but when do you do it? So it won't cause, so they're old enough to be able to process it in a healthier way while keeping them safe. It's hard. Thank you for your comment.
I think I saw a hand in the second row here a moment ago.
I actually took it back down because I realized that I don't actually have a question. Yeah, I guess I don't. Obviously, as an African American, it's traumatizing to be in this room right now with mostly white people listening to this topic and processing all the emotions that come up. And when the conversation drifts off to immigrants, it feels like it's so much more comfortable for white people to talk about immigrants rather than the African Americans and the Native Americans that have been here for a long time. It's not quite so shiny or something. And I actually just came back from a weekend of healing racialized trauma, like last night, so I'm pretty like fresh, and I have a little bit of like emboldened attitude going on that I wouldn't ordinarily speak in front of this many people, but here we go. Like Nolan mentioned, the shark, it's the water, the culture of white supremacy that we swim in. It's not the shark that's getting us, it's the actual waters that we swim and the air that we breathe every day. And until white people learn how to yield space with humility to people of color, and until people of color can speak up without having to take care of white people and their feelings, then the change isn't going to happen. And until we can stop siloing off all these separate fights around the environment and racism and the military and economic inequality, we're going to stay in this shit. So professionally, instead of thinking about how you can help fix immigrants and stuff, consider how you can study to be an anti-racist, because every day, if you're not an anti-racist, then you're a racist. And consider confronting or working with your other white people on not being part of the white supremacist culture.
And part of the work I'm trying to do here is saying the same thing, but let's just have a recognition of trauma where it often is never recognized. So thank you for that.
And in the same corner of the room here.
Yeah, thank you. That was really addressed what I wanted to ask a question about. This whole thing with not many people not recognizing white privilege and how that affects. That's another layer to the trauma, I believe. If as a society we don't accept that we have that privilege because of our skin color, and we don't have to worry about our children in the same way. And I just think that is, I don't know if I'm expressing it clearly, but thank you, because I think what you said and what you have talked about is really how I feel. I really want people, and I think this room probably already is in step with leaning to be better people and understanding how people of color feel and what they go through just in breathing the air.
Yeah,
So.
and understanding white privilege is one thing, and it's important. And what I usually come up against is a sense of guilt that comes with the recognition, right? And that tends to stop people from, like, people can't get past that. Like, what do I do? Or they get angry with that, right? There's different ways in which people react to guilt. And so what I say it in my classrooms too, right? Because I'm dealing with college students who are really trying to tackle this and figure out where they're going in the world. Being guilty isn't helpful to anyone. It's what you do with the new knowledge you have from here on out, right? You have this privilege, great. What are you going to do with it? That's more important to me than you feeling guilty, because that's just a waste of energy on everyone's part, right? But what you do with that is really important. So everyone here, now you know about Black trauma. What are you going to do about it?
And right back here.
Thank you for a great talk. I really appreciate it. I'm wondering, as we train medical professionals or therapists today, the panacea response to this is to do implicit association tests and have people be aware of their implicit bias. And I wonder what you feel about the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of that kind of approach.
It's ineffective. And the reason I can say that so confidently is a lot of my students are now med students, and then they come to me and like, yeah, this is crap, right? And then they ask me to come talk to the med students. I'm like, the students aren't the problem. It's this med school that, you know, you're taught to memorize the body on the inside, but not bedside manner, not care, right? Personal care, because you're only given 10 minutes anyway per patient. So what can you do? But even the racialization of medicine itself, right? The drug companies and the pharmaceutical companies, how they're racializing how drugs are marketed, that in itself is going to cause a problem, has caused a problem. So it's systemic, right? This is a systemic problem that's around money and capitalism. How do you, I'm going to get myself into trouble. How do you take that down? That's not for me to figure out. I'm not an American, so I can't do that. But how do you take that down? Because in order to even elect the right people, what does that mean when you have to be of a certain class to even stand for election? So the ideas of democracy are built into that too, which is a problem. So I don't know what the answer is, but I think it has to happen from the grassroots up. And everyone sort of learning how to do better and be better, all of us, right?
We have another question over here.
Thank you very
Thank
much
you.
for all that you've shared. It's difficult for me to ask this question. I feel shame and self-awareness about having been a white American all my life.
You don't have to
And-
carry the burden of the entire race. It's fine. No, I'm serious. But I appreciate you being honest, yeah.
Well, the question comes from acknowledging that America did not invent slavery or racism or tribalism. And yet there seems to be a persistent virulence and violence to what we call the African American experience. And I'm not a historian or a sociologist, and I mean, clearly genocide persists around the globe for whatever differences we may have. But what is it that's so, if it is, so distinctive about the American experience and this white supremacy that we carry forward that makes it so tough to beat back this racism? And as an example, I would say that just in my lifetime, we've come leap years in how we address homosexuality. But we have been at this racism thing for hundreds of years, and it's still kicking us.
This country was built on racism. The Constitution was built on racism. So that means the solutions have to be that fundamental, right? So to change it, you're going to have to change the foundations, which is why it's harder to change. And the country's big, right? So your issues here in Maine don't resonate with folks in Arizona or even Rhode Island, right? And so how do you get communities to talk to each other across this vast nation with different local issues and different populations? And when the Constitution was created, this country wasn't a quarter of the size it is now, right? And it hasn't amended to take into account the size of the nation and the diversity of the nation just by geography. So that's why I think the situation is different here than in Europe, perhaps, where the countries are small. I mean, there are problems in Europe, please. I mean, Brexit, hello, but there is a difference. And having enslavement happen on this soil, as opposed to like in England, I'm a child of the British Empire, but slavery wasn't an inherent institution in England itself, on the island, right? It was elsewhere. And that also affects, how populations and how generations view and think about race. I am not getting into that.
I think we have a question right here.
But it's not even it's not in the Constitution, which is why I think there's more wiggle room. Yeah.
So one of the things I want to, you're a historian, and I feel like there's a new narrative being written. I really feel like things were whitewashed. I mean, Michelle Alexander's book really spoke to that. That it's never stopped. We canonized Martin Luther King, but we really weren't listening to what he was saying. He was vilified. Even as a kid growing up, the Black Panthers were kind of an image to me, and I watched
and a negative one too,
right?
Yeah.
And through the thing, and I can't think of his name right now, was murdered. I mean, they recently had. Which one?
Right.
And can you talk about the whitewashing of history, where we all want to feel good and everything's like okay, and what are you complaining about? We've come so far, but in a lot of ways, it runs very deep. That's why they call it a stain, because you can't get it out. And just, I feel like we are living in a time where, we're trying to rewrite the history and really tell a deeper narrative about what's going on now. So could you speak to the history and the narrative and the whitewashing that goes on?
Well, there's a whole course about it that I teach, but it's true. I mean, one thing I do, so I teach the civil rights movement, and I get students go, oh, I know about it, I don't have to come to class. I'm like, nope, come to the first, and I talk about King, that's the first class. And then whatever bubble they had created, burst it straight away. They're like, oh, I knew nothing, right? So even though King has been put on this pedestal, what you've been taught isn't the whole story. He's also a very complex man. He also did stuff between the years of 63 and 68, which no one knows about, right? And he was actually, when you actually read what he wrote, he was saying some really radical things, right? And one thing I do is I ask how many people have read or heard the entire I Have a Dream speech. So how many folks have heard the entire thing? Oh, wow. Way more enlightened than my students at Brown. It's 14 minutes long, right? How much do they normally get to hear? The last 5 minutes? And so when they hear the whole thing, they're like, whoa. I mean, it blows their mind. It's quite fabulous. I don't have to do any work after that. I just have to stand back and watch them get mad. Why didn't I know? And this is Brown University students, right? Ivy League. Why didn't I know about this? I'm like, exactly. Why didn't you know about this? Who's writing your textbook? I mean, then it goes back into politics. How is history being taught? And there's an undereducation in this country, I believe, of history. Because I came to the US as an exchange student. I went to Mississippi, which is why I ended up doing US history, in case you're wondering. And in high school, I knew more US history than the Americans I was in school with. I didn't have an extraordinarily amazing, I had a public school education, right, in England. But we were taught history and world history, not just our own, right? But everyone. So that's a really long-winded answer. But I think you're absolutely right. As the academy is being diversified, because of the mass movement, the histories are now being addressed as such. But it's trying to get folks to read it and think about it and understand it and not cling to the narrative of the founding fathers, which is compelling and has, is much older history. And then, even then, there are folks like, in African American studies who are doing work on the founding fathers, but it does look very different, right?
Okay, we had a couple questions in this corner of the room. Hopefully we can get to them both in turn.
Yes, great
Hi.
talk.
Thank you.
So a number of the comments seem to be consistent with this school of thought put forth by Ibram Kendi and others that you can't talk about racism devoid of the institutions, and maybe it's primarily or even exclusively an institutional phenomenon. So, I mean, what's the framework for acknowledging Black trauma? We have the individual aspect, and then we have the institutional. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, I've already said, right, racism is systemic in the foundation of this nation. So there is a systemic problem. And then, so how do you address that and think about it and conscious of it every single time you have to make a decision? You know, sort of being critically analyzing everything you hear and see, and then choosing to make different choices or educate the folks around you, or it's hard. It's going to be I don't have any solutions. For me, it's about, let's get to this acknowledgement first, and then see what we can do with that. What do you do with this knowledge? What do you think needs to happen? And what can you do from where you are? And I think we can do a lot. You know, short of revolution, which is not going to happen, right? What are the other ways in which we can make, and it sounds so corny, but make this country a better place? I wasn't going to use the words, yeah. I had to catch myself there for a minute. And how will it happen? From the grassroots up or from the top down? I would say the only way it's going to happen is from the grassroots up.
Here in the back row.
Hi, thank you for speaking with us. I don't have a question, but just wanted to offer one possible answer to your question of, now you know about Black trauma, what are you going to do about it? And I'd offer it to anyone in this room. There's a woman named Rachel Cargill that set up a GoFundMe to raise money for Black women and girls. It's a therapy fund. And you can go on her GoFundMe page. It's the first hit on Google when you type in her name, Rachel Cargill Therapy. And you can donate money. And she disperses the funds to Black women and girls that don't have the financial resources to pay for their own therapy. And it's just a way of redistributing wealth in a way that our system doesn't allow naturally anymore. It's a way of individuals redistributing wealth and power. So I would just offer that to anyone that's looking for one thing that they can do.
Thank you.
Yeah, Cargill is Cargylle. E at the end.
We have another question over here, Professor Hamlin, over here to your left.
Hi.
Hi.
So I am in a relationship with a Black man. He's from Haiti, and he moved to Florida when he was 8. So being from originally Vermont and then Maine, we have some miscommunications, I guess. He always said he would never date a white woman, and I understand. I understand that there's a lot that I don't understand as to, why he, like his life experiences and all of that goes into that. He also tells me that I wouldn't be able to handle being Black, and I totally believe him and his experience and everything. In trying to be a good partner and just hopefully a good person in general, reading and trying to understand as much as I can about the Black experience and about racism in the country. We've had discussions, and like a lot of, I'm sure, well-meaning white people, it's like he gets kind of annoyed if it's like a textbook response. Mm-hmm. And I know as white people, we should let Black people and people of color speak about their own experience, and we should listen. I'm just kind of wondering, how can I be a little less annoying? Not that I think he's like blatantly annoyed by me, but I'm sure as a whole, if I guess there's certain things that white people do that seem like super fake.
Well, there's also an earnestness that sometimes can be annoying. But ask him. Ask him that question. Don't ask me. Ask him. Right? Well, I think, you know, everyone's different. His life story is different because he's coming from Haiti too, right? So he has two sets of experience, national experiences of race, and whatever took him out of Haiti is there, and his family and all of that. I'm married to a Haitian, so. So this is being live streamed. I hope he's not watching. But I've just got myself into trouble. But so ask him, and let him tell you what he needs, and then yeah, that would be my own. You know, I mean, I'm glad that you want to, but ask him what annoys him and what he would prefer. No, but seriously, I mean, it's clearly there's something. That's why you're together for a reason. Ask him what that is. I've become a therapist now. I didn't realize that. No, it's fine. It's fine. No, but it's true though. I think part of what I'm saying is like listen to people, and don't assume that your knowledge is better than or more valuable than, and this is for anyone, right? Is that, you know, but that sort of idea of listening and understanding the shoes, the empathy part, is really important in thinking about life in general, right? I mean, this is just good social skills, but also, you know, thinking about trauma and so the real serious stuff ahead of us and with us right now.
Another question over here, Professor Hamlin.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And your research. I grew up in a lower middle class community that was, you know, I went to school with lots of people from lots of different backgrounds. And from then, you know, through school and high school, I always heard from my African American friends that Black people don't commit suicide, and two, we don't do therapy. You know, it's just like, and I'm 65, so that gives you an idea of where, you know, where and when. And I was also raised that therapy is just for rich people. So, and you know, you have problems, either help somebody else or just work hard and get into your life. So I'm wondering what you think has changed in that generation, in general, and also specifically for African American folks. And the second question is a much more difficult question, and I say it with respect to you. When you showed the pictures of Emmett Till and his bludgeoned face, what went through my mind was conversations I've had with African American friends and other people of color that are like, I don't want to see any more friggin' pictures of Black people dying. Yeah. So my question is, like, I know it was important at the time that Emmett Till's mother wanted those pictures in Jet magazine. She insisted to show mainly white Americans what was going on. But how, in this day and age, do you decide whether to post a picture like that?
That's a very good question. And when I do this on knowing that there are a lot of students, I have the trigger warning, which is new. I never used to have to do that, right? So this is, again, so the change in culture. And perhaps I should have done it today, so I apologize. I showed it because I wanted folks to see it. And just the way that Mamie Till wanted the folks to see and she said, what they did to my boy, right? And also to see the images that galvanized that generation of people, because it really did, in ways that are extraordinary to me. You know, I've a lot of work working with civil rights veterans across the country, and just talking to them individually, they all point to that picture. So it's an important picture, but yes, there's too much Black death out there for consumption. So I know you're absolutely right, and I mentioned that with, you know, social media, we actually get to see it, right? Sometimes live, which is horrific, and I don't press play with that because I'm like, okay, this is going to depress me. You know, I don't need to see it. One, I just want to say that what is it about how we segregate communities and schools, communities which then segregate schools, right, by race and economics, so that you actually got a multicultural experience, but richer people don't. And I think that's a problem, right? And we can talk about how education is funded and why those schools look the way they do demographically. But I think it sounds like you have a more of an awareness because you grew up with the people who from everywhere. So you have a more sort of empathy, a sense of empathy than other folks who weren't as who had more money. And that, for me, is striking and ironic and should be as one place that we should start thinking about changing, right, the structure. Yes, I still get the Black folks don't go to therapy, right? And my husband, oh gosh, I shouldn't talk about him. He's going to freak out, yeah. But he's a therapist, but he'll never go to one. That's bad. So there is a culture of that. And I think with college-age students in particular, and sort of students, or maybe I'm just seeing it more at Brown, they're very aware of mental health issues. They're very aware of the services and using them, and I'm not sure where the change has happened, but it's happened relatively recently, since I've been teaching, and I've been teaching for almost 20 years. But that's not a long time. And I think there are more resources on campuses as schools themselves have been looking to diversify their student body. Having support for everyone has been more of an issue and a motivation for campuses to bring more people on board, more deans, to deal with the things that will bring to campus. Bring with them to campus as young folk, right? Does that answer your very complicated question? Thank you.
Okay, we have an individual right here who's been waiting.
Hi.
Hello, thank you so much. Actually, you kind of answered a little bit of my question just now, but my question revolves more around the theme of isolation, parallel themes of not being seen, not being heard, feeling alone, which you kind of talked about in your talk of, families also being terrorized, parents not being supportive, or even the two Caucasian activists, moving on with their life, and then the black one, couldn't as easily.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not asking you to project into the future. I'm more asking as a historian within the last 10 or 20 years compared to the last 40, 50 years that you were talking about in your talk, if you've noticed differences in feelings of isolation when you've witnessed current young activists versus the activists you were talking about earlier, especially since stigma around mental health has been shifting, social media. Obviously, we have more space now to talk about these things slowly, but we also have very intense polarization going on as a counter consequence of that. But so my question is, the feelings of isolation in this movement, in current activism versus past activism, similarities, differences that you've talked with or you're sensing?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sensing that there is more self-care on community level, right, as groups of activists work together. The sense of isolation is still there in terms of access to media and access to the narrative, which is why the problems are still there. So thinking about, again, so I'm thinking about Black trauma as one way of understanding what current activists are doing and going through as a historical process, right? It happened then, it's happening now. Maybe we can do something now to help the young people out on the streets now. And what are they facing? What does their trauma look like? And does it look different from the past? What were the strategies in the past that worked? What could work now? But yes, the society has changed, shifted a little bit in terms of mental health care, but the issues have shifted a bit too, and the technologies have shifted, everything's shifted, right? So there is never going to be a sort of a natural blueprint to place on today's time, because it does and should look different.
Professor Hamlin, I've shifted this side of the room here.
Hi.
Hey, how you doing? Thank
Well,
you
thank
for the speech. My name's Raymond. I'm from Portland, Maine, and I grew up, in Maine, and I have a lot of friends who are Republican, and just like when you showed the slide of when Black Lives Matter came out, white people came out with All Lives Matter. I just first think like black men were considered 1/3 of a man, and that was like a stigma put on them to be held down. And I was doing some research on the battle between the Muslims, like in earlier times, like from 1000 on, and I just feel like there's a lot of hate and unnecessary war, and I think there's a lot of facts that are out, and no one should be considered 1/3 of a man when we're obviously a man. And the stuff's still going on to this day, and I just feel like I had to say something, and it does bring up a lot of emotion, because we were poor growing up. Everyone in the neighborhood, mom and dad together, house, trust funds, college funds, and we have nothing. And I feel like black people are still kicked down and held down, and it's like crabs in a bucket. Everyone's fending for themselves, and we're being held down because we're black, and we're just as much as men as anyone else. We're just kind-hearted people just like anyone else. Doesn't matter about race. And I believe it's just evil for you to have your eyes blinded to that. Everyone should be treated equally. And there's enough land where people without a house should be able to go get a plot of land and build it. Chop down the tree yourself, build your own house on a plot of land. There's so much land. There's people in government with 10 houses. What do you need 10 houses for? This is obvious common sense, people. So if anyone's in this room and you're Republican and you want to turn a blind eye and you want to hold that evil in and think you're better than someone and hold down people, I don't know what else to say. That's just wrong. It's wrong. And I don't really have a question, but I just wanted to talk. Thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you for talking.
Right up here.
Thank you so much for your talk. So UNE has a big focus on the health professions, and my work focuses on human trafficking, and there's been a big movement towards trauma-informed care in all areas. And in the area of human trafficking, it often focuses on specific events related to trauma. And so I'm wondering, when it comes to trauma-informed care and the trauma is being black and breathing the air, how do you, what is trauma-informed care in that case?
I have no idea. I'm not a healthcare professional, but I think it does have to be specific to that situation, and it wouldn't be the same as the trauma care that you would provide for those victims. That's not a very satisfying answer. Sorry.
And we have a question right here.
Thank you. Well, thanks to the gentleman, I can't see him, but who spoke, gave me the courage to ask this question that I've been pondering and feeling like I'll sound ignorant, but willing to become informed. So I recognize that when you're in the majority, you often think of the other as inferior or, with scorn or whatever. But what I don't understand, and I hope as a historian you can inform me, is what happened so many years ago when the black people who became enslaved, they were the good people. It's the other people who took them and made them become slaves were the bad people. So if we have good people over here, why?
What changed?
Yeah.
Religion has a lot to pay. And at the point of thinking about racialization of folks and who gets to be human, if you can rationalize that these people aren't human and they were designed by God to serve, then you can do this work and go to sleep at night thinking that you're holier than thou, literally. So go back to that question about, how could this happen in the US? Look at how Christianity has been adopted and morphed into something that doesn't look very Christian to me, yet sustains a side of politics that doesn't look very Christian to me, right? And a way of treating other people that doesn't seem very Christ-like to me. That is the crux of sort of this Enlightenment thinking at that moment in time. And there's been scholarship talking about one of the main reasons for the American Revolution is that England decided to end slavery. And America as a colony didn't want to, because that was the economic force that was building the colonies to be strong enough to think, and they did, beat the British. And so when you think about the revolution not being about tea, right? But it was about tea to some extent. It was about the decision making. But at the root of it was sort of changing the economic system of the colonies. If you were to abolish slavery in Britain and the colonies and the empire, it would have dramatically, this country wouldn't look, well, it wouldn't be this country, it'd still be a colony, or who knows, right? So when you think about all of that, sort of those things in place and flying around, it makes, you can see why this country ended up the way where we are now. I have no idea what time it is, so I'll keep going.
Sure.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for that answer. And as somebody who's very interested in studying theology, I was wondering if you could speak to, have the Black churches been a comfort or help to folks who are dealing with Black trauma? And if not, why not? And is it analogous to people's question as should the Jewish community have fought back during World War II, or were they just advised to suck it up?
I hesitate making those analogies between the Jewish experience and the African American experience because the history and the timelines are so different, right? And sort of the racialization is different. However, I also don't want to lump Black churches as one thing, right? Because they're coming from different denominations, different parts of the country, and it looks very different. And trauma, and so what I was trying to do here is kind of think about Black humanity as as a diverse. Humanity is so diverse. We all have very different threads and things going on in our lives. So church becomes just one of those threads, and the stigma of trauma, well, not the stigma of trauma because everyone's suffering from it to a certain point, but the stigma of understanding mental health in the Black communities, particularly under the church communities, folks looked after each other in a different way, right, within the church. So you wouldn't have the language of he has a mental health issue, but oh, he's special. We do this for him. He's good. We just watch out for each other. So the language is different, and the community care is different. Yeah, and access to mental health treatment was non-existent, right? Mental health hospitals was used as punishment. People were shipped off there, and not by by the state, right? Not by their own communities. So there's also this sort of hesitancy to get doctors involved comes from that as well. That's a really roundabout answer. So yeah, I don't feel equipped to make generalizations about the Black church because they are separate in some ways, but also dealing with the same issue. I mean, it's still part of the community. It's just one part of it. Yeah.
Last question, comment here.
Hi. So it takes a lot of courage as a person of color to speak about trauma in an audience like this. And it's okay to take a pause after you've heard a story of someone who's super emotional. Like, if we were in a predominantly Black audience, there would have been a pause after my brother over there shared so emotionally. Like, just sit with it.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Françoise, for an incredible
Thank you. Thank
lecture.
you all for your questions.
Thank you.